connectivity becomes poor.
Yes.
And then you can read out the questions. I'll come back as like within a minute or two if I get disconnected. But suppose I get at the wrong time, you ask the questions or read out, or Raghu can also take over. Raghu can also.
I have a bit of a problem, and that is that the font size on my chat becomes so small कि हमसे पढ़ा नहीं जाता ठीक से. But हम देख लेंगे.
I can read out the questions, sir. No problem.
Yeah, you just edit the questions. Edit, मतलब जो भी questions है ना, क्योंकि यहाँ पे when I put it on my screen, for some reason, and I haven't yet found out how to increase that font size.
Yes.
वो छोटा हो जाता है screen.
It's all right, sir. After the conversation, I can read out the questions that is on the chair. Or if
Pranam
ma'am
sir,
is there,
Janak ji भी आ गए हैं. Pranam sir.
Janak sir has also joined.
Namaskar.
Namaste, sir.
Good to see Rumana as well. Namaste. So we'll start in a minute or two, or we wait for 2 more minutes, isn't it? Okay.
Good evening, Raghoo sir. Pranam Janak sir. Vijayashri.
Good evening. Vijayashri, I can see you on the screen. Good to see you.
Same here, sir. Janak sir, Pranam.
So, sir, I'll switch to my laptop. There is some problem. Like when the calls come, then it disturbs the connection. The laptop, the video will be very poor, but audio should be fine. I'll switch to my laptop. Fine.
Yes, sure, ma'am.
And you accept my, and let me just switch it. I'm disconnecting from here.
Yes, I have accepted.
So, sir, is audio fine?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
I think this is better. I can see also. Okay, shall we start now?
Please.
Yes, ma'am, I guess.
ऐसे आराम से करते हैं. Good afternoon, everybody. I welcome all of you with pleasure. And in fact, it's very interesting to see so many of you joining, and I'm sure many more will join. And for me, those who have joined us today are generally the dreamers and the thinkers. because otherwise they wouldn't have joined us. They definitely want to ask questions to themselves. And therefore, I'm glad to be with all of you. I must say that I share the same anxiety that all of you have, that particularly arises out of our collective struggle and failure with democratic actualization, both at the level of individual and the institution. Why we are holding this lecture series, I don't think I have to give you a reason, because our life is the reason. That life we are living in last several years, and also to a large extent several decades, is the reason why we are here. We see how we are losing our democratic spaces, our voices, how the institutional autonomy is compromised. I mean, all of us teach in different institutions or study in different institutions. We live as individuals in different domains, and we see how the democratic spaces is sinking, day by day, and how we are gradually developing tolerance, as well as, we are comfortable. Things start looking very normal. On-freedom is becoming very normal to us. We don't anymore raise questions. We say, "Theek hai, chal jayega, achhe din aayenge." Things will be better. And we have developed these spaces, this psychological condition, which is probably, which works many times against democracy. And I remember all of you must have read Mercury's One-Dimensional Man. Raghoo definitely you must have read. I teach a lot of Frankfurt School scholars like Adorno, Mercius, and Franz Fanon Kafka in my cultural psychology class. The first sentence, the first line in the book reads like this. Of course, I'm reading it with a bit of revision. A comfortable, smooth, reasonable, democratic unfreedom, quote unquote, democratic unfreedom exists in this country, in this post-industrial liberal society. And we don't see, the processes that creates these conditions of unfreedom become invisibilized, and we also get naturalized in the process. And that's probably the biggest challenge we experience today to democracy. And that's the reason we thought we should meet and we should start discussing as responsible citizens, as well as professionals. We belong to a particular professional community. And as professionals of, say, as psychologists, we need to definitely set out a more radical vision for psychological renewal to combat a dehumanizing cult of materialism and unfreedom. What we have seen in recent past, we need to challenge them and undo. So we have realized that very little can result from our current practices, except more oppression and more tyranny. If we remain silent, if we allow this unfreedom to prevail in the guise of individual freedom, individual choice, many other things, then what will result is more oppression and tyranny. We therefore need to listen to ourselves very deeply. As I said, our life is a proof to our history of unfreedom. We don't have to look into anybody else's life. Just look into our own life, the life that we live at home, the life that we live in institutional spaces, or in any other formal or informal spaces outside home. That's an evidence too, the kind of unfreedom we're experiencing today. So we need, therefore, to listen to ourselves deeply before our leisure is lost and our capacity for thought is destroyed. I'm again drawing from my earlier readings, but where do we get our concepts or lens that allows us to see through what has been actively and almost daily invisibilized? So most of the processes of oppression or domination or marginalization or leading, processes that lead to unfreedom are actively invisibilized. And we've seen how things happen. Media plays a role, our own logic plays a role, our, the instrumentalization of different, surveillance systems or reasons do, justify what is not to be justified. And therefore, it invisibilizes this. And we have to rise it above it. But where do we get our concepts or lens to look at? And this is where I thought we should talk to scholars who are sitting on boundaries and moving between the boundaries, who pick up concepts that destabilize the already established concepts of a discipline. And that's the reason I thought Raghoo is eminently placed to inaugurate this lecture series. We also decided to, why we call it lecture/conversation series, because we thought lecture becomes too straightforward, very goal-oriented, and sometimes instrumentalizes the discourse. But then some scholars will be more comfortable with lectures. Okay, we'll have some lectures, but we'll have conversation with scholars where the scholars, as well as the audience, enjoy far more freedom to engage with concepts, to create tensions, create more tensions, destabilize concepts, and also look for new concepts to make things more visible, to make uncomfortable, unpalatable things visible. Okay, and that's the reason we thought we'll get, feminists, subaltern scholars, critical and cultural historical psychologists, and also some psychoanalysts on board to dialogue, to discuss the relationship between psychology and democracy, and also what kind of psychology we need in order to strengthen the institutional practices in a democratic country. And let's also admit one thing, that we need democracy. We want democracy and nothing less than that. And that's the reason all of us are here. And we all know that democracy is extremely brittle. We have seen how we lost democracy, which takes several decades, years, centuries to come into existence. But we lose in no time. We lost in Iran in no time in 60s and 70s. We lost in Germany in 30s and 40s in just no time. It takes so little time for it to slip into, non-existent, not non-existent, at least a far less democratic system, or even a more authoritarian regime. So we cannot take democracy for granted. We have to work for it. We have to preserve it. And as a professional belonging to a community of professionals, we have this responsibility of talking about how to preserve this democracy, how to strengthen the democratic institutional practices, what kind of people, what kind of personalities we need for a democracy. Therefore, what kind of role psychology needs to play. So we need a psychology, that exposes the institutional practices promoting on freedom. And are we practicing that kind of psychology? And a psychology that creates psychological conditions for democratic actualization. This is very important. Many scholars talk about it, but we need to now actively debate, okay, what processes we need to set in for realizing some of these democratic, values, ethics, and potentials. When I say psychological conditions, I refer to, this is my personal view, but I refer to tensions that we create between individuals and the institutional practices. We should not immediately become very comfortable with institutional practices that are not democratic or that are not sufficiently democratic. So we need a discipline that creates this tension, that creates this discomfort, that doesn't allow us to sit in comfort with things that are not democratic. And so, and therefore we decided to have this lecture series. We're planning to have roughly 10 lectures / conversations. Maybe we can have more also, depending on how long we sustain the interests of people, and also how much of scope we have within NAOP to debate this. I invite Professor Raghoo Sinha to this lecture series, and as I mentioned, he's eminently placed to inaugurate this lecture series or conversation / lecture series for the following reason. I'll tell you, I had very brief interaction with Raghoo in the past. And every time I heard him, like, I couldn't ignore his voice, very deep voice, and very, very questioning, semantics. And so I used to turn back to say, okay, who's asking this question? Okay, except when I interacted with him a little longer. That was in a workshop which was organized by Professor R.C. Tripathi. Allahabad University was bringing out a special issue, Silver Jubilee issue for Psychology and Development Society. And Raghoo was one of the 2 discussants of my paper on Madhyam Marg. What Raghoo did was, Raghoo, do I say Professor Raghoo or Raghoo is fine?
No, just Raghoo.
Raghoo is fine. I like the name, Professor D means it. Okay. What Raghoo did was he brought in numerous concepts from photography and eloquently discussed my chapter on Madhyam Marg. And he was so brilliant. I thought, my God, he can actually, he has this capacity, unusual capacity, to take us far beyond the limits of our usual categories and universals into an unsettled ground, which is what I was talking about in the past. And taking in not only psychology, but also philosophy, evolutionary biology, bird photography, sports, etc. along the way. In fact, I've met some scholars like him, but there are very few in this country. And I always like to engage in conversation with a scholar of this kind. So I invite Professor Sinha to this lecture series. And here I just want to mention the structure of this conversation before I hand over the mic to Raghoo. Okay, there is no mic. This is a medium. Okay, so there are mics. There's no a mic, And if Tushar wants, Tushar can shut me down. That's brilliant. So we still have democratized to some extent. Not democratized, diversified this control. Okay. Raghoo will go like this. First 10 minutes, I would like you to place your ideas on democracy and psychology. And we can also, coin the terms like democracy and psychology. We can also coin the, phrases democracy for psychology, whichever you use, but tell us how you prefer that, coyness, because I want to hear you also on that. This is a new series. I want to deal even at lexical level, why I'm using this term and not using this term, why I'm putting a comma or full stop or colon. I mean, these are major markers. These are major mediators. So please place your views on psychology and democracy for first 10 minutes. And then once you do that, we will ask you questions, and you can respond to our questions. It'll be a kind of dialogue. So it's not like rapid fire, the way people now do on TV. They have taken away the pleasure of conversation, I mean, who do I blame? You have all the Bollywood stars doing rapid fire all the time. So that's not what we're going to do. We'll just ask you some questions and you respond to them, and we'll go at your pace. And forget the questions that I had written to you. I will ask questions impromptu based on what you speak now. And after you place your, views on democracy and psychology. We'll take 3-4 questions, including mine. We'll take from audience as well. And then we'll respond to those questions, say in 10 to 15 minutes. Then we'll take second round of questions. So we'll try to do 3 rounds of questions answers if we have time. If you do not take long, we will try to do 3 rounds, and then you can wind up your own views. And if you want, you can take comments at the end. I'm scared to take comments in the middle because some people may go on, and I won't know how to stop. So please ask very sharp, precise questions, and we will have time for your comments at the end. We'll take comments at the end of this 3 rounds of conversation. Raghu, over to you.
Thank you, Minity. And thank all of you. I'm adequately nervous to see so many people because I normally do not have this many people in my group that I address. Let me begin by saying that I will begin with the sort of a biographical point, and I thought that's a good enough point to begin with. There was a book that came out in the late 60s, early 70s, by a Western scholar, Barrington Moore, who started trying to talk about social origin of dictatorship and democracy. Now, I'm not going to paraphrase the book, but all that I remember now is that it began by saying that the same circumstances, social circumstances, or more or less the same circumstances, not very different, gave rise and can give rise to both dictatorship and democracy. He was one of those scholars who was placing that dictatorship and democracy at 2 opposite ends of a spectrum, and both can get enough fillip from the same social occasion. So one of the things that I learned from that, and I want to put before you, is democracy or dictatorship or any form of government that we see or can envisage is not inevitable. There is nothing in the social circumstances that will say that if you have these things, automatically you're going to get dictatorship or automatically you're going to get democracy. If you have X genes, you will become democratic. There's nothing inevitable, which leads me to believe that democracy or dictatorship is something that we do. It is done by mankind and it is structured by mankind. So that is the first thing, because there is enough history and social science writing which says that if you have these conditions, inevitability there will be X or Y. So there's no inevitability. The second thing about democracy is its romance. And I will come down to a working definition, just bear with me for a minute. The romance actually comes from after the Second World War. The romance comes from a notion which says something to this extent, that the way out of whatever tragedies we have had in the Second World War, the way out of this problem is to go for democracy. And it was in this period, post-Second World War, that decolonization started. That is, the imperial forces and those colonizing forces started releasing colonies and making them independent and many a times democratic, or at least a republic, if not democratic. And this thing continues. And therefore, there is a euphoric aspect to democracy, which I want to address right in the beginning. And that is, as Johnny Walker would say, "Lakh dukho ki ek dawa nahi." We have this kind of a romance that we believe suddenly that if we have democracy, all the problems will get solved. Or if all the problems are solved, then we are democratic. No, there's no inevitability either in that sense. So let's not romanticize democracy. It's very hard work. It's brittle, as Minity put it. It is also something which needs a lot of work to be done. And it's certainly not natural. If you look at the history of, or evolutionary history of man, there is nothing in the evolutionary history which would give you that there is an evolutionary basis for democracy. So it's not a natural phenomena, it's a man-made phenomena, and therefore needing very deliberate acts by men. And consequently, it is fragile. Fragile is that it breaks down. Anything that needs too many prerequisites for democracy, there should be a free press, it should have these conditions should be fulfilled for democracy to happen. The moment you put in conditions to fulfill something, that something becomes fragile. It can be broken. As Miniti herself puts it, we have seen it. We can be democratic one moment and swing to the other end the next moment. So please, it has to be inculcated, created, and sustained by very hard work. With this kind of preamble to what democracy could mean, I would like to add two more salient points, and those are that by and large, if you read literature on democracy, the story somehow the other always begins with Athens. And they say that this was what democracy, whether it was a full-fledged democracy or not, I'm not going to debate that just now, but it begins with Athens. I would just like to point out that maybe not everything of democracy begins with the West. There are enough precedents within our own ancient history and mythology, if that's what you want to call it, enough evidence and notions of a democratic government, beginning with the Janpads and ending up right up to 1947 or something, or beginning till up to date, I would say. However, formal democracy in most countries are not more than 60 to 70 years old. It comes with the nation state, it comes with constitutionalism, it comes with a certain formation of citizenry, and it comes so we have very recently, we have a very short historical experience of living in democracy or trying to make democratic institutions. Because democracy is valued, we tend to call every institution and every action that we take as democracy. But that's not really true. We have not lived long enough in democracy. Let me give you a simple example. If you take that all adult populations are allowed to vote, if voting be a measure of democracy, it's a very minimalist measure, and I wouldn't say that that's the full definition of democracy. I can even imagine that there can be a democratic country without voting, but that's fantasy, but nonetheless, it's imaginable. If voting be the criteria, then full adult population voting in the United States or most of the European countries comes very late, 68, 70 in America. We got it a little earlier. But what, 70 years of experience, and that also of an imperfect formulating democracy? So whenever we are talking about democracy, we are talking of a very new human experience, which has very little historical support to it. And therefore, there is an adventure. I would always like to say that let's have an adventure to democracy. Feudalism, kings and one great god, one great man, dictatorship, benign or otherwise, we have a much longer history of it. We have a much longer experience of it. We have much longer and deeper analysis of it. Therefore, we can critique imperialism much better and dictatorship much better than to talk positively about democracy. The democracy has these things, right? But nonetheless, democracy is a way of life or a way of governing and living in a society. And if it be that, then the historical situations in India, which have preceded us, our traditions, our culture, our values, our own social realities, would definitely impact upon democracy. And therefore, most of the time that I would be spending from now on psychology and democracy would be within a limited concept of democracy. And the limiting factor is that the local Indian factor is what I would like to talk a little more about rather than the universal factors of democracy. So let me pause out here. And this is what I intend to do. And I'm trying to work out a working definition of democracy, at least as far as my talk is concerned. I wouldn't say a talk. I'd use the word by exploration, but I would like to use the word tatolda out here. I am exploring the concept of democracy by just going blindly into that area. Of course, we're having psychology in my mind. The minimalist definition of democracy is something like this. It is a form of government where the leaders or people who govern us are elected through free election. In these elections, the total or adult population can and does participate. The elected government can be removed by another voting round. The election is in, and there is an independent legislature and judiciary, and these protect the rights of not only majority, but also of the minority. And there is a freedom of speech and movement that within the democratic setup, you can critique any form of government, any form of government policy, or anyone for that matter, and can move freely as a citizen within that geographical area which constitutes the nation state. To this date, I am going to strict myself that democracy is a nation state phenomena. It is not a civilizational phenomena. It is not an imperial phenomena. It is within the constitution where a citizen is allowed, and all the citizens of that nation state are allowed to vote. If a section of that citizen is bereft of voting, is alienated of his voting right, like in some places criminals and mentally sick people, then that is the exception. But the rule is that everyone can vote and does vote. So this is the minimum definition of a democracy as a political governing institution. This, however, does not take into consideration, or that this definition does not take into consideration the relationships that both institutions form with each other, and more importantly, what individual and groups and social groups form among themselves and the individual members of that group. For me, democracy can best be seen in the kind of relationships that prevail in society, rather than just the minimalist definition, you vote diya ki nahi diya, or election hua ki nahi hua. And that is why I wanted to put in place the notion that there is this, what we are talking about is the minimalist definition of democracy. Let's add to this little minimalist idea of democracy, and then you will start finding that social and psychological factors would start playing a role. That's my take on that. I would rather pause out here and take any questions, if you have any, about the minimalist definition of. I have not as yet begun talking about the psychological and the social relationship concept within which democracy is available. Or if you want, I can go that way. So I think let's see where we stand in our conversation till now, and then I can go one step further and start talking about psychology and some of the psychological concepts.
Raghoo, I don't have any question at the moment, but if audience has any question, we can take on the
certainly.
Theme. Yeah. Anybody has any question on this, the way Raghoo has defined democracy at the moment for deeper engagement from a disciplinary perspective?
Yes, ma'am. This is Rita. I have a question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes. Sir, I heard your minimalist definition and also the points that you added subsequently. But in last 1 decade or so, I have realized that opposition is the most critical phenomenon or feature in a democracy. So how you did talk about minorities being protected, but I think it goes beyond. So how do you see the role of dissent and opposition in a democracy?
Well, what you are putting forward is that democracy, by definition, has to be and will be representative, which means that some people will represent larger people and they will meet in another form, which is in most cases the parliament. And by and large, what you are saying is that within the parliamentary system, there can be and will always be an important role for oppositions to play. That's the party kind of democracy that we see. Let me just paraphrase that. And I would say that in democracy, there is protest and opposition as an essential part of democracy. I would even go one step further, that if everything is totally unanimous, then it is not, as Bodhgam puts it, it is not an actualized democracy, it is actually a fictional democracy. And there are enough. So there is a role for opposition, and the way to oppose it, the methods of opposing it, the methods of protesting are all part of the life of democracy. So I totally admit to the fact. Does that answer your question, if I've understood you right?
Yes, sir. So, but I think what I was trying to say that realization that how critical opposition, however small it is so critical in a democracy. That realization has come to many of us, I think, lately. That is right. But I think you've answered. Thank you.
No, I lost the last part of your conversation. Yes, opposition is critical for democracy, but opposition by itself and the way you make the opposition point, that is, the criticalness out there is not about if there is no opposition. The criticalness is that how and what way the opposition analyzes the situation and communicates. It's the relationship of that. So I'm not just putting it opposition is necessary. Suppose as the fragmented parliament we have, where there is no one party which is really in opposition. Everybody is fragmented. It still will be democracy. You don't have to have one party in opposition to make it a democracy. But nonetheless, opposition is necessary. If that's what you're saying, I totally admit to that in my minimalism.
Raghu, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, ma'am.
Am I audible?
Yes, completely.
Okay, so I would like to go back to the minimalist definition of democracy that you just enunciated.
Please.
And I think that you were basically talking about democracy as it unfolds within a political system. Okay.
Yes, yes.
All right. So, but now I feel that there is also a social and relational matrix within which the democracy unfolds.
Yes.
And if you were to try and understand the relationship between psychology and democracy,
Yes.
the manner in which democracy unfolds within a social relational matrix will perhaps become very important. So can we attempt another aspect of the definition which takes into consideration the social and the relational spaces?
You're absolutely right, Namita. That's where I hope to go after this. After this, I hope to go into that. And that's why I call this a minimalist definition, because this gives you what the political and external forces minus sociology and psychology, when they talk about democracy, they are going to talk about this kind of minimalist approach. How it unfolds, and that is why, without kind of mincing words and trying to pull one of the Supreme Court judges' judgment, he should have actually said democracy is a way of life, rather than whatever he said. It is a way of life. Democracy unfolds itself in the way you relate to your child. In both our cases, Namita, you and me, the way you relate to your grandchildren. It does not only restrict itself to the political exercise and the exercise of governance. That's the central point I'm making towards it. Since we brought this up, let me remind you that when Cromwell went to Charles II, I think it was, and said that we want democracy, Magna Carta and things like that, and signing of democratic rights in England, Charles turned around, the king turned around and says, democracy, Mr. Cromwell, is a foolish Greek notion that assumes extraordinary quality in ordinary men like you. Democracy will and can function as a democracy only if the quality of people and their relationships change. Unfortunately, we don't have too much of experience of this change, nor have we tried it very seriously. But I totally agree, and that's why I called it a minimalist definition. Yeah.
Shall we proceed or we take one more question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Now, like when we look at democracy and our experience as India, do you think it's a value position which we have imported from outside? Because from monarchy to colonialism and to democracy, we didn't give ourselves space to like explore other form of governance. So like people say that like our society was not prepared for democracy because they were not literate and other factors also. So do you think it's a value position, or this is the only ideal form of governance?
Yeah, you're in some ways, Romana, you're absolutely right. I think Janatji will bear me out. The CSDS is established in order to see, with Rajni Kothare and others, established only to see how democracy can be planted in or in India. Believing that democracy is a completely Western notion and it is being implanted, तो उसका indigenization कैसे होगा? Indigenization कैसे होगा? And what institutes, what are the blockages for democracy and so on? Unfortunately, that's a terribly Occidental idea that democracy per se has to come from Athens or from the West and only in the post-colonial period. There is enough work now we have some, but we need to do enough work that there is a notion. Janpaths were a notion. And Janpath followed but it was a very small set of notions. Face-to-face democracy was there and representative form was there. It was removed by Ashokan imperialism and so on and so forth. Within some institutions, there were still this democratic practices allowed. So it is important to understand that there is Indian roots to democracy too, right? Rather than only believing that it is a foreign institution. Parliament came about only as a foreign. Yes, I do believe that there is a lot of foreignness to it. But it is not that our traditions are bereft of democratic traditions. Without utilizing that everything. I'm not saying Ramaraj was a democratic Raj. I'm not, or Mahabharata happened within a democratic setup. I'm not. But there is still within Indian traditions, both tribal and urban traditions, some evidence to suggest that there were democratic way of living even within India. So I'm not going to believe that it is totally an outside concept and therefore dangerously impure concept, and therefore we should purify ourselves by removing this foreign concept. No, I'm not going to believe. I know, I'm just kidding. I purposely went.
Raghu, not
You know that,
but,
yes.
During your discussion, you can reflect on just one thing because Romana brought that up, and I'm happy that she brought that up. When do we say that we are ready for democracy?
No, we don't.
Yeah, no,
we don't.
We were ready for.
No. Yeah. My point is that democracy, and I hope I'll get there sometime. Yeah, but the point is that the democracy is such a verb, and we insist on making it a noun. Yeah. It is not a noun. Let me say that even what we are doing just now, right now, while I'm conversing with you, is trying to establish a process, a verb, which will feed into the process of democracy. Right, and that is where both the protest and hard work lies. For that matter, I would go one step further, and I would say that most educational institutions where education is one of the pillars of democracy or pillars of any form of change, the discipline itself is sometimes not democratic, or even trying to be democratic. Our relationship with our children are not even sometimes the same. And therein lies the whole role of psychology. They've studied it. There are many of these factors have been studied in the Western notion of democracy, but I'm really not. America is not a very good example of democracy, no matter how much of all the other constraints of democracy. Let's be very clear of it. But
every other personality.
Yeah.
That they are the best democracy. Any other question, or Raghu proceeds with his reflection on social psychological?
There is a comment in the chat box by Professor Prakash. Yeah, the question, the comment is, as the democracy is evolutionary and historically a recent phenomena, and it is to do with the human psychology, how people think and behave. It is not a bit early to speak about democracy and psychology when psychology itself may be argued to be very undemocratic. I don't know whether the question makes any sense. Welcome your comments. That's why Professor Prakash.
One of the things, great things about democracy is that it ultimately ends up making sense of everything we say. Sense making is not restricted to the educated, the uneducated, or premised upon certain conditions. Okay, so yes, it makes sense. Yes, democracy, it is too early to talk about democracy, but it is not too early to talk about processes which may increase the probability of democratic fruition into democracy. But it is, we cannot wait for Radha to have Norman ghee before we start dancing, or she starts dancing. It is even before democracy has come in whatever imperfect forms, we have to live with it and try and align our experiences, our cognitions, and our thought, our living experience into making it, quote unquote, more democratic. So the movement from Kacha Aam to Pakka Aam needs effort and psychological inputs. And that is what is meant by, those psychological inputs are what is meant by democracy and psychology. As far as the discipline of psychology is concerned, it has experimented. One of the areas with Professor Panda was hinting at, unfortunately completely left, is the Frankfurt School, which tried to do this. There are institutions in India which have also tried to do it. There can and should be a way of looking at Indian traditions and contributing to the processes of democracy. Yes, I totally admit to that. But by and large, the discipline of psychology today, as it stands in textbooks and associations, is not very conducive to the flow or the verb of democracy. Verb, I means the activity, the actual working out on the ground level, as what Namita was suggesting, in interpersonal levels, intergroup levels, maybe even the psychic level. Right, but let's not overcorrect that everything happens in the mind. Individuals are important, but they are not the summum bonum of democracy either.
We also have too many institutions and other machineries that create desires in us, that create psychic tendencies in us. So reducing to everything to individual is problematic. Yeah. And also, I mean, we can't then discuss democracy, role of democracy in shaping a discipline. It's actually both ways, the relationship.
Let me suggest that actually, I would feel more comfortable if we left the word, the noun called democracy out of our purview and started talking about tendencies at democratizing ourselves or democratic tendencies. It actually involves restructuring of identity.
Yeah.
And that is one very strong area of psychology which can bring in very important inputs into the democratization process. How our identities form, by and large, what we have studied is how they were formed. And they were formed within, by and large, not democratic processes. Therefore, psychology needs both experimentation and speculation as to how do we make things more democratic, despite the fact that we may not have enough experience of it. One of the things that both Tajfel and Turners and Charles Taylors, if to name a few, some people in India too, I think, did try to talk about, is how democracy is both a process of embeddedness and disembeddedness. Democracy as a process if you want to call it a value, but I would like to call it a process, is simultaneously a process that seeks continuity and roots within your tradition and has and must have a tendency to say that these roots are not sufficient to describe me. I belong to this, but I am not that which my parents are or which my tradition is. To disembed yourself from the past is as important a process for democracy as embedding yourself. So the process, the psychological process that we're talking about is how do you relate to your past and traditions. They are not the same, by the way, but I'm using them as a broad category out here. And at the same time, move away, disembed yourself. In fact, in one group I was talking about, and there was a time, I think, I'm sure Janarji and obviously most of you teachers would know, that we had to give a character certificate to our students. I don't know if it still continues or not. And we used to normally end up by saying so-and-so is of good character, right? And the certificate, it is a set form mein aata tha. If you really want a democratic process to be involved in to that level, I think we have to give a certificate that my student is of doubtful character. That means my student is full of doubt, has higher ambiguity tolerance, can take in contradictory ideas, is not too sure of himself, and that is a personality or an identity which is far more conducive to democracy than an identity which is full of certitude. I'm just metaphorically making that point, but that embeddedness or that certitude that comes with identity, at least the way it has been conceptualized till now. I would go one step further and say that it goes closer to being cynic or cynicism than anything else. So this whole business of what used to be referred as ambiguity tolerance should be built into a characteristic or a dimension of identity which is required to be cultivated. It doesn't come about by itself, cultivated both in classroom and in family settings and in democratic institutions. I know I'm sticking my neck out, but that is what I am trying to do. I'm trying to say that we have to re-look at this identity and certainty business that we have done and create a little more. This has been called tolerance to ambiguity. It is also in some places called openness and so on, but I'm adding a dimension to it. There's yet another dimension. And by the way, we can practice this in classroom. Nothing that I'm going to say from now on about psychology is only about textbook. It can be practiced too. And the point I'm trying to make is that it is these practices which will teach us to become democratic in future. And these practices may not necessarily be in tune with what we have traditionally called education. If questioned, I will go back to it. There's another point from identity which I want to talk about and bring in psychology there. Where else will it come? It will come only in questions of identity and individuals. Is the whole notion of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism, as cross-cultural psychology people would remember, it has a long tradition. It basically means me and my group is better than other group. Okay, so it's in that interpersonal sense that ethnocentrism comes in. And we can be different but not superior or inferior. Democracy, therefore, thrives on the wake of difference. I think one of the meaning of Vyas is also that he who can differentiate. It begins on differentiation, and this ethnocentrism is basically saying that we can learn from people who are very different from us. So the doubtful characteristics that we are talking about in one sense, or ambiguity tolerance in one sense, I'm carrying on that who do we and what do we learn? And who do we and what do we learn? We learn most from friends. Yes, that is also true. We learn most from the teachers, maybe. But we can learn also from people whom we dislike and learn deliberately from them, not just as a reaction. And that is what makes ethnocentrism a very interesting. I have one life experience, of course, I'm exaggerating this life experience. I came from a family where anything you did with the left hand was considered impure and not very good. And of course, there were people, not in my family, who were left-handed, but there were people around whom we saw left-handed, and our parents or the whole menu kept trying to tell us, देखो ये गलत कर रहा है, अच्छे लोग नहीं है, उनका दिमाग नहीं ठीक है, all that kind of thing. Came to school in Allahabad, and fortunately or unfortunately, in most of my classes, the fellow who used to talk used to be left-handed. And a few of the left-handeds that I know of, they were still around in the academic and the neurophysiological world, were left-handed. Now, it became a problem for me to reconcile this business that, yes, Bampanthi hai, or Bam Margi hai, or Ye is the most intelligent person. Now, to learn from a left-handed at that point of time was a sort of a traumatic experience. And it is this kind of learning deliberately from people whom we dislike in our own in-group ethnocentrism. That is the hallmark of the democracy, or democratization processes. So it is not just being disembedded. I'm seriously trying to find a dimension of ethnocentrism and relating it to the notion of who do we learn from and why do we follow them. Okay, so seriously talking about democracy, we would have to have psychological inputs. Believe me, there are. If I go into one only, then it'll take the whole time. But there are attempts being made to try and see how we oppose and why we follow. So the Frankfurt schools, by and large, were firstly trying to do something. And, in the earlier stages, they were completely left. After that, you move a little away from that. But we're trying to actually see why there is dictatorship, but they ended up or moved more towards why do we follow? It's not only Schachter or the others who start doing this, but why do we follow? And questioning your ability and the motive as well as the psychological advantages that you get in following is something that we need to understand. And there is work on lot work on leadership, a little less work on followership. And it is the followership understanding which will make probably a contribution to democratic processes. Let me also share with you some little things in this that we can do. In my teaching experience, at least in HRD and other means in regular psychology also, whenever we got into some controversy or got into a debate, in the name of democracy, we follow almost an evil practice and we say, chalo, ispe vote kar lete hain. How many people? Now, that is one of the most anti-democratic thing that you can ever do. Okay? वोट कर लेते हैं और जो जीता वही सिकंदर is majoritarianism. It is not democracy. Democracy lies in the relationship that gets established in between majority and minority. It does not lie in the rule of majority. And this is a notion which comes both from the Greek and to a large extent also from our better understanding of the Dharma in India also. That it is not just the rule of majority. And why should we go? In classrooms, we can also experiment that for some time, let's try and implement the plan that has been defeated. And there are people in organization, and again in the West, I do not know of any Indian organization which has done this, is that those things which have been thrown into the waste paper baskets are actually picked up and tried to be implemented. You learn two things with this process. One, we learn minority is not always wrong, as it is believed to be, or the opposite of majority. We also learn how to implement something which we don't agree with completely. And this is what is an essential part of our experience of democracy. If we do not learn in the schools and colleges, on the playing fields and at home, to implement other people's dreams and only implement our dreams, then we are not learning democratic processes. Right? Once again, there seems to be some evidence to suggest that let me just rephrase this. I'm blowing my trumpet. I'm a sportsman. We get a lot of people who come and play very well. They lose, some win. Those people who give you the reasons for their winning and those people who give you reasons for losing, if you look at and analyze what reason a person gives for his losing, you can very easily decide who is going to become a champion and who's not. It is the experience and churning of the disadvantaged situation which actually gives you an insight towards the working of the champion's mind. Most of the time, we have seen that people who lose tend to give you, and this is a very psychologically established attribution kind of a thing, give external reasons or chance reasons. Very few people who lose tell you, I made a mistake there, I didn't do that thing right, I didn't do this, I misread that signal or whatever it is. And therefore, one of the things that I'm suggesting and which is going out of practice these days is quote unquote sportsmanship. We don't play, our children don't play enough games, they don't play enough things to learn to analyze losses. And that's why oppositions today in parties also become so painfully bad. They are just facsimiles of the ruling party, which has not. Winning, on the other hand, the attribution is more towards the self and less towards chance. And people who give you the wrong reasons for winning also do not become champions. So this whole business of analyzing your predicament and then coming out with the reasons for your behavior is an essential part of the experience of democracy. So when you have a department mein or in a class only, you have something that we disagree. So many people say this, so many people say that, you're numerically less, you're numerically on. Okay, fair enough. That if you have done that, do that. But then please go back and start analyzing for both the groups, what is the experience of winning and what is the experience of losing, so that we can learn to understand both the minority positions in political sense. I'm talking of only political minorities and majorities, because this is what. So how to handle that experience is an essential part of education, or should be essential part of education. I think, Minty, how much time do we have? I can pause out here. There are many more things to do, which is not necessarily. I think we are through with about an hour, but I would feel more comfortable by taking questions out here. Let me just take 2 more points and then we can take questions. There is another experience and something which of late has become important, but it was there probably in some sense even earlier, and that is learning how to handle powerlessness. Fortunately or unfortunately, whatever the way you want to put it, the joint family experiences within the Indian context was not necessarily democratic, but it taught you to still remain balanced in your powerlessness situation. What has happened today, by and large, that we have legitimized the experience or normalized powerlessness. That is, when I feel alienated and I feel less powerful, that people in this situation should and do just the emotional action. In democracy, when you experience powerlessness, you should be able to analyze that powerlessness and not give only an emotional response. Hurt sentiments, therefore, become a very, very dangerous, both for identity formation and democracy. To be hurt is completely legitimate democratic right. Again, exaggerated. Last but not least is, what do you do when you have privileges? And I won't go into that just now. I'll just stop out here, just in case there are questions. I do want to come back sometime, maybe in the comment section, in this haphazard presentation, about talking about future technologies or learnings or psychological practices for democracy in future. But democracy in future is not going to be anywhere very close to the parliamentary forms that you are looking at. Can I pause out here? I can take some questions. Is that all right?
Yeah. Let's take some more questions. Yeah.
Yes, Janaki has a question.
Answer.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Can I take a couple of minutes? Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
Am
sir.
I audible? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Two issues which you may like to reflect. One, if we take history of conformity research in psychology and combined with Milgram experiments on obedience, then we arrive at a conclusion that how foolish are common people to be obedient to an idiotic authoritative order of giving punishment or agreeing to majority who are really foolish, but still people agree. I think psychology was excited about this in 50s and 60s. Till in late 70s, Moscovici come in that big changes in the society does not come from majoritarianism and majority. It comes from active minority. So probably this is what I thought I wanted to share, that majoritarianism or having majority without having, as you mentioned in your talk very well, having a discussion or consensus on the idea in honest sense. If you go by voting, then that is not democracy. That is like ass experiments or Milgram experiments of nodding or agreeing or stupidly punishing a hypothetical person who did not exist actually. So the common psychology, the way people react, that I got opportunity to say, and they got opportunity to say, that's enough to be feel like democratic, is probably, you have very well explained that that is not democracy in true democratic value sense, which you have not elaborated, maybe you'd like to. But the minority, active minority, is the most exciting thing that comes in psychology from late 70s and 80s. But still, it is half-hearted taught in psychology courses. It is not taught full-hearted. So the notion goes on, the majority is majority and all that, something like that. So the propaganda machinery of democracy, that voting and rather than debating, that probably makes the democracy the weakest form of the government. If you do not debate, you just go by, mera neta kaisa ho, on that basis, then we end up with that result. So I thought of appreciating your comment on which you began earlier, that the notion of democracy to win the election and voting without understanding what is going on, what is the issue, what for we are voting, is foolish mass scale manipulation of our collective identity and all that. So that's so I will just stop here.
Yeah, thank you, sir. That's a very important input. And I'm looking at my notes on the half the screen there. So there is also a notion. You're absolutely right as far as the active minority of Moscovici and others are concerned. By and large, that tradition of work came from actually notions of creativity and historical analysis of the European experience, not the American experience.
Oh, yeah.
Of the European experience, where most of the creative ideas towards the late Enlightenment period came not from the universities, but from outside the universities. And therefore, these people were the active minority groups, and we can debate that. But within that chapter and Milgram experiment, there's your friend, Bibb Latané. Now, Bibb Latané's concept of social loafing actually at times militates against the archaic notion of democracy. Along with that notion, there is, and this is what Fatah Ali, what is his name? Fatah Ali Moghdam, no? I think is his name, the psychologist. And he starts talking about social labor. So one side you have people who can in democracy and do in democracy do social loafing, right? And at the same time, in the name of democracy, there are people who would put in more social labor because they are trying to achieve something great or value rather than just loafing. So both these tendencies have to be manipulated. And I would say, very interestingly say that if you leave democracy on the default drive of human beings and say that democracy aaram se ho jayega, then I can tell you democracy will commit suicide. Incidentally, Aristotle's own statement was democracy is so bad that it will always commit suicide. Because I can give you many examples of this kind of logic. I say, because democracy does and must have the tendency of destroying itself. It is how you work these tendencies which are important. और हम लोग के यहाँ हो ये गया because of what the propaganda machine that you're talking about is that एक बार हम लोग ने वोट दे दिया तो हम लोग तो qualified Democrats हो गए. अब थोड़ी I don't have to go back home and work on my democracy or whether I'm democratic or not. I have done the Om Pavitro Abapitro Vacha, I have done the ritual. After that, I don't have to think whether I believe in God or not. So the ritualization of democracy is something which we can, and the ritualization of teaching, the ritualizations that we follow in teaching. आप लोग सब लोग खड़े हो जाइए, अब आप लोग एक एक करके participate करेंगे, ये democratic process है. Now, you can see the contradictions that are happening there. And that's all that I wanted to hit at. If I get a chance and we talk about future of democracy with modern technology, there is some hope there. There's a face to face. कुछ hope दिखाई पड़ता है, but danger भी ऐसे.
एक word सिर्फ कहेंगे. Actually, one definition of democracy should be: this is the most successful mass manipulative process, and you are a successful democracy if you are successful as a mass manipulator. That is what it is. Yes, if you believe in the present form of democracy, a winner of votes takes everything, then you're absolutely right. If there is some other meaning of democracy other than voting and parliament, then I will have difficulty with that. But in terms of political governance and power, what you say is absolutely. नहीं तो क्या है, किशोर प्रकाश या प्रकाश किशोर जो भी है और कैम्ब्रिज एनालिटिका, ये सब कहाँ से, ये सब तो वोटिंग को ही इन्फ्लुएंस करने वाले हैं ना. They are the master influencers. Google and the likes. And protesting against that and knowing that they are, in fact, psychology is almost completely sold to the advertisement capitalist model and the consumer society. But that's a different point which we can discuss some other time. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, any more?
Any other question from the audience?
Somebody?
Sir, I wanted to ask, जब आप future में बात करते हैं, आपने, I don't know if you read that essay, Henry Frankfurt ने एक essay लिखा था on bullshit. He wrote, and a lot of people are doing some sort of research on it. तो दिक्कत क्या है कि जो आप बात कर रहे थे कि groups and minority majority relation, उसमें एक बहुत important process है कि किस तरह की information processing चल रही है, किस तरह से perception deal किया जा रहा है. तो even Tajfeld, when he did minimum paradigm wala thing, at some point, जो in-group, out-group categorization होता है, वो arbitrary होता है. Once you do that, your processing of the external world changes to a certain extent. Or abhi, given the technologies we have, we are manipulating the process of that perception, how that in-group, out-group associations are being done. And once they are done, तब आपका परसेप्शन मैनिपुलेट हो जाता है. तो आपने जो दो बातें कही उसमें अगर आप कुछ कमेंट कर पाए कि Frankfurt had this idea कि we're not actually lying in the public space, we're committing bullshit, so we are just putting things in the world that are being processed, that are manipulating that perception. तो आपने जो एक बात कही कि हम सिर्फ वोटिंग नहीं कर सकते, क्योंकि at the end of the day contradictory idea है कि you have to listen to the minority of one also, but उसमें फिर authoritarian tendencies भी हैं. और अगर आप वहां पे इंफॉर्मेशन प्रोसेसिंग को मैनिपुलेट कर दे तो आप यू कैन नॉट टेल वन फ्रॉम द अदर if it is authoritarian or if we are being democratic. So in that sense, if you can comment on how the information ecosystem is doing it and how the future will shape that in that direction.
I don't know who's speaking, but I would much prefer if you came onto the video or I could see your face, because I don't feel very comfortable talking to a nameplate. I want to see a face when I'm talking to. Yeah. So in one sense, let me say that you're right. Right in the sense is that I agree with you. That's all I mean by that. And that's what all we can mean in a democratic system. That it is today's world, the way information is fed to you and the capacity of analyzing and processing that information is tuned itself, it will, and my submission to you, as it stands today, has greater probabilities of moving towards dictatorship, centralization than democratic. Even if you believe that information processing has given more decentralized notion, I am of the firm belief that it is actually at one point of time centralizing it. So the future of democracy, therefore, does not lie so much in only information decentralization, but the way we process the information and act upon it. So that given this, the notion that how much of it we participate in, to a degree, I would say that democracy actually tries to minimize the distance between, Vijay, am I allowed to give this example? Between हाथी के दांत दिखाने वाले और खाने वाले. If many Democrats, and you are, since you understand a bit of, or most of Frankfurt schools, people, you will find that they do participate, that if you have to go into a public space, there are certain etiquettes of discourse that you will follow, which are actually what? Bullshit. Okay, so to that extent, speaking the truth on, because this is the interpersonal relationship. Now, this has a component which goes into the family setup. It also goes into the family setup, that how many times when somebody in power is within the family is bullshitting, how many people who are lower in that family hierarchy can come up and say, you're bullshitting. And giving the space for that is very important. Let me give an example which I began this talk with. I was talking when informally, and I said, my granddaughter has this habit of teaching me from Australia. So we have, every week we have a class, and she has a whiteboard. She plays the teacher, which probably is in a school, teaches me maths, reading. I have to raise my hand and ask her, teacher, can I ask a question? And I raise my hand and says, teacher, can I ask a question? And I asked a very badly formulated, truly academic question. And you know what she did? she turned around and says, Baba, sorry, Nanu, is that a question or a comment? She is not 8 years old just now. And how many of us have a situation in the family where we can come up to the people who are in power and say, is that a question or a comment? That is the democratic relationship. That is where critical thinking comes in about. That is the space that we create. And believe me, it is not created in abstraction. It is created within the concrete reality of tradition and of life. These are the experiences which we are not being able to give to the generation, and therefore the hopes. But 50-50 hai jo dictatorship hoga ke democracy hoga. But I understand the import of your question. I can take it up, maybe.
One more thing, the thing you said about servitude, we're becoming certain in, like we cannot, but everything is driving towards every personalized environment we are put into by the internet or anything is pointing us towards our own certainty. And we cannot see, one of the problems in this bullshit, why I asked you is because you question what knowledge you have, what facts are, that becomes a questionable thing. And when that becomes questionable, two people cannot agree on a statement, what it means, and neither true or false, neither the falsity of the statement or its truth, then how do you deal with the idea of whatever you said?
I have some ideas of dealing with it, because if you do a wee bit of counseling, that's precisely where you get into. Meaning making is precisely that kind of an exercise, right? But democratic healing, which starts with, to some extent, with in the abnormal or the clinical situation, begins with R.D. Lang and others when they start making these little breakthroughs in what we now call psychiatry or psychotherapy. There is space for it. And one can debate it, but you're pointing out to a very important area. And I hope Professor Panda takes up this, because the attitude towards the attitudes and handling of the unconscious is an essential part of democratic upbringing or democratization process, without falling into the trap that it is only reason and only reason which will lead to that. So there is a possibility.
Yeah, Raghu,
yes.
I mean, I'm delighted to find, the ways in which we deal with the questions of relationships at home without talking about how gendered it is, Maybe I'm a woman, I'm too sensitive to this question of patriarchy, so I bring it up front, and you probably, but you seem to be not using that, but in 101 ways talking about it. The kind of things that we see now in this country, if I look at the psychological foundation to that, because we're tolerating many undemocratic processes in majoritarianism of the kind we were discussing about, it starts from home. Our experience of relationships in a gendered home has taught us to be quiet, to tolerate, or so some of the psychological foundations start from there. Second, look at the education process and also the way adults talk to their children. So when an adult asks a question, the adult expects an answer. So if there is a question, there has to be an answer. If the child says that, no, I don't have an answer, or I do not know the answer, it's not very much appreciated. So the whole pedagogic system, both at home and also in school, and the way the patriarchy and the caste operate, they create this psychological being that tolerates or that sort of allows this undemocratic processes to continue. And I think we'll get some feminists also. I mean, that's not Raghoo's job to do it. Raghoo did a
Yeah, definitely you should.
But what I'm seeing is that all of you were sufficiently bringing this relational, everyday, context to our discourse. And this everyday is also not democratic. So when we say the psychology has to serve, I mean, the psychology not serve, that's also a bad expression. Like what kind of psychology? Yeah.
Can I just come in,
please come in.
Slightly tangential way? Vidya, I would kind of refrain from saying that the situations that we are living in mostly are not democratic. I would like to put it slightly differently. I say almost all the situations that we are living, not almost all the situations that we are living in, has the potential of becoming democratic.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. And that is where the slight optimism in me comes. Otherwise, I would have become a good cynic. That it is possible to convert that. And it is that potential, that little potential that we must. I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. Right. So, but that potential lies there. Yeah, that potential lies. And therefore, there is a possibility of both experimenting while you're teaching in class and while you're living life outside the class in home, to try the psychological things of experiencing what a democratic experience might be. And it is that potential which we need to tap and therefore fill the gap that is there in the world that we haven't experienced enough democratic processes. So if you can supplement the democratic processes, if there are any outside, please do that. But if you can supplement it and make people experience democracy at home, within your restricted environment, use psychology, and there is enough in psychology, and we can keep on debating which aspects we can put in to do that at home. And that is the hope for future. Of course, with electronic and technology, media becoming one, why can't we have a web parliamentarism? And why have this permanent representation? Why can't web become a community by itself? And citizenships are decided by this web notion. Web, say, I mean electronic, this thing, where of course, there'll be one democratic difference. And that is all conversation on web citizens will not begin by conversation on weather, but it will begin by saying, "Hamari awaaz aa rahi hai ki nahi?" So in future, when we greet each other, we will be greeting them. And there is ironically a very important metaphor in hamari awaaz aa rahi hai ki nahi. And that is the metaphor of the voice. What we are talking, whether the voices are heard or not. That's the basic notion of democracy. If it is heard or not. There are two aspects to it, and I'm using a very revolutionary poet's metaphor out here from Pakistan. Oh, he actually was from Muradabad, went to Pakistan. See, I'm a chauvinist. I'm a nationalist also. Went to Pakistan, who says that the only problem in mankind has been that baat nahi kahi gayi aur baat nahi suni gayi. Democracy in terms of voices is a relationship. Therefore, all empathetic hearing and all that things that we do, those little skills that we try and impart, are part of the democratic experience, or at least giving a taste of democratic experience. Jahan baat कहने की हिम्मत होनी चाहिए, कैसे कहें, how to put it into democratic form, and उसको सुनने की भी होनी चाहिए. So it might sound as a stretch that this little skill of active listening and all these things that we do in counseling settings and others, is essentially a part of a democratic system. Let me just give you a very small anecdote from Tagore, and I really enjoyed it. The mother was working in the kitchen. She was very busy, cutting vegetables, doing all sorts of things. The child was playing outside. One feather from one bird fell down. And the child picked it up because that feather talked to the child about the flight, about the swans, about Himalaya, about all these things. Child thought that it was the most valuable thing. He ran with that feather, and this is Tagore's story. He ran with that feather to the mother and says, "Ma, here is," giving the whole world to his mother. The mother was very busy. She turned around and looked at the feather and says, "Arey, ye to ek pankhi hai, ek hi feather hai." And Tagore finishes the story. From that day, the child never spoke the truth. You see, and this is the experience. It means for me, democracy does not end or begin even with the management of government. And that's why I kept on insisting it's a way of life. It's a way of breathing. It's a way of relating to every intimate thing. And democracy percolates there. And consequently, the education and experiencing of democracy can and should begin from there. Therefore, it's a vast kind of this thing. I've left the future out because I see Sir being there. Tripathi, sir. I know you were busy with some other meeting, which I was also trying to tune into. But
sorry, Raghoo.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I knew that you were there and something else. Yeah, any more questions? And I can then wrap up a little of my thought and then see if we got more questions.
Hello.
Yes, Namita. Yeah, Namita, there's a Pallavi, I think. I can't see the screen very well. Yeah, please show your face if possible. I feel much more comfortable talking.
Yes, sir. Hello, sir.
Yes.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Sir, you talked about the hope from technologies in future in the process of democracy. I have read a lot about the damage that is being done, like throughout the world, the governments are exploiting the space between the speed of technology, matlab speed of development of technology, and the legislation that they are bringing. So there is a lack between these two things, and governments, instead of trying to fill the gap, they are now enjoying the process of exploiting it for their gain. So you talked about the good things, hope, optimism you have from technologies. I want to know, would you please like to elaborate what hopes you have from technology?
Raghu, take 5 minutes. I know you have full thesis on this. So take 5 minutes and answer this question. I think.
Yeah, I'll just take 5 minutes.
Yeah.
See, in every age, epoch, or history, whenever some technology has entered society, it has led to two very important tendencies. And these two tendencies are almost opposite to each other. But one tendency has won more often than not. And that is, it has led to the status quo being more accentuated. Let me put it most bluntly, the more powerful, the richer, become more powerful and become richer. The poor become less powerful and less, right? Beach mein gradation hota. Absolute grades have been going up. The differential, all technologies would lead to that and have led. There is another aspect of technology which we must be clear about, that by definition, new technology, or technology for that matter, which most of the time is new, technology and the follow-up experience that goes with that technology, there is a lag. The whole society doesn't experience it. And therefore, people who are in power use it for strategic purposes, and gain more power. The French thinkers, and in French, we use these two terms very differently. Strategy is always used by people in power to maintain status quo. Strategy is never used by people who are in the low power. They may use a thing called tactics, but strategy by definition is of maintenance. And the French thinkers make a very clear difference that strategy is always for the powerful to remain. So they use technology strategically to maintain and accentuate the difference between powerful and less powerful, more fortunate and less fortunate. Today's technology is unfortunately moving towards greater centralization, and therefore I have a little less hope. But I still have a little hope out there that this new technologies, both in terms of web and information, may still have the Arab Spring coming about. It may still have a potential of making us experience both virtually and really and in process information for democratic purposes. And let me tell you why I have that hope. It is without reason. It is an act of faith there. Otherwise, I will have difficulty in getting up out of my bed tomorrow morning. Therefore, I have hope. Otherwise, I would be sleeping. I have said that otherwise I would become completely cynical. So only to prevent myself from becoming cynical, I have some hope there. I'm exaggerating or making a kind of a cynical remark out there, but it is an important thing that there is a possibility in the new technology to be used for. But if you ask me, in today's centralized technological world, every form of protest is done by people who are in power. Even the opposition are managed by the people. So even today, when my critical thinking of the system begins, my critical thinking is itself informed by and made by people whom I'm criticizing. They have not only captured your mind, they have captured the oppositional space. Lalu Prasad Yadav was the best critique and the best opposition to himself. So there is no space left for opposition. And I'm not talking about Noam Chomsky. I'm talking about the space. They will allow you safe space. They will tell you that be very safe. You are a great protester. You are a great supporter of environment. Please fly 1,700 miles for this meeting. Now it becomes a little ridiculous to talk about the most polluting flight that you take to find, and the oil industry that gets supported. So there is a great amount of danger that we are already caught in the matrix. And even the protest is manufactured by and captured totally by, and I'm not a conspiracy theory, but is totally captured by Google and Amazon and the likes.
Thank you, sir. I got my answers. Yes, sir.
I'm glad you got your answers, although I'm not too sure whether it is much of an answer or not.
The faith thing is dominating. That is how I got the answer.
Okay, good. I'm glad I still have some vestiges of faith because I'm a doubtful personality, as I told you. Therefore, I need the last hope in the Pandora's box to come out.
Thank you.
Raghu,
Yes.
wind up in another 5-6 minutes. We can take one last question.
Yes, we can take a last question and we can. Yeah. Yeah.
Can we take
yes, please.
I'm trying to turn on my video.
Good to see you. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's so talking about something that you just mentioned, technology, and I've been reading this book called People versus Tech by Jamie Bartlett, and he says that democracy, the idea of democracy does not fit in the whole digital world, the way our minds are manipulated by social media. So by that way, would you agree that democracy nowadays is more of a myth? And if it is a myth, then how does it affect us believing that there is a thing called democracy?
Seth, let me just say that I use a new term. It's not very new, but it is still a new term. And I say collective moral hallucination. Democracy is not a myth, but it is definitely a hallucination of the mind, which wants to believe that there is hope. And it is that belief that is asking me to relate and analyze critically. Let me tell you, we have kind of not really understood very well in the rationalist tradition of knowledge the role of this kind of myth, if that be called a myth. Okay? But I would refer you to some more writings. There is a book called, what is it? The Idea of Idea of Progress. I think Berry, not John Berry, but it's written in the early 60s. Many of the ideas which are mythical, non-real, in that sense false, right, have had real social consequences. Honesty, justice, you never find it either in nature or in reality ever complete. Right? But they are. There is also an evolutionary evidence to suggest that fairness, listening, has some evolutionary advantages. So we can fall back on that too. Okay? In nature, if you look at Jane Goodall's work, and that gorilla lady who was killed, her work, you find that even in the natural setting, if there is unjust or unjust distribution of food, there is protest about it. And as you go with language ability, as you go up the phylogenetical chain, you will find that there is greater protest. So fairness, some way or the other, though it has a mythical element to it, has very real consequences to it. Okay, if you want, I can put this in the Marxist terms. False consciousness has real consequences. That's the traditional Marxist way of looking. Yes, caste is a false consciousness, if you want to believe in that, but it has very real consequences. So I'm not too bothered about whether, but I'm certainly not a person who believes in metaphysical kind of a thing that justice lives in the super consciousness of XYZ. I still am that it happens within the relationship, within the experiential world of human beings and the cognitive worlds of the human. That's the point.
I believe the difference between me and you would be that you are more towards the optimistic side and I'm moving more towards the cynicism side, perhaps.
Believe me, I'm so glad that you are towards the cynicism side. We definitely need more cynics in this world if democracy has a iota of chance.
Yeah.
Cynicism, and there are very good works being done at present which have traced the origin of cynicism. Cynicism also has a very deep-rooted origin in Indian philosophy and Indian thinking also. It's not just jigyasa, there is that cynicism is an essential must. And very deep-rooted origins in Indian thought also. So don't run down the cynics. Don't feel bad about being cynic. Enjoy it cynically.
fact, if you are a cynical, your cynicism will force us to bring changes. So that's good.
To some extent, I would say.
To some extent, yeah.
At least my hope is there.
Yeah.
Being cynic and being humorous are absolutely essential part of democratic experience. Please, there can be no democracy without appreciation. The aesthetics of humor is an essential component of the democratic experience.
Yes, that's amazing.
I'm going way beyond without giving you references.
At this time is actually a very huge area.
It's a huge political as well as literally enlightenment and liberating component to it. It does have a component of distraction. It does have a component of diffusion. It can be used for diffusion, but it is a very important ingredient of our democratic experience. And the day we lose a sense of humor, we will become dictators.
Yeah.
Or dictators.
Also, we communicate with dictators through humor now, because everything is so people now are more creative with their humor, There's the time people create more humor. But that's how you communicate. How do you talk? If you state the fact, you are behind the bars. You are in jail. So you speak through humor. I see humor, doing all kinds of things. Yeah. Raghu?
ह्यूमर का नाम सुनते ही सर ने सोचा प्रैंक खेलते हैं, तो he became serious and he is laughing.
Raghu's screen has frozen.
Yes, I guess there is some connectivity issue.
He'll reconnect.
Yeah, sir is disconnected, but soon he will be connecting. So it has been a wonderful session, ma'am. And whenever we listen to Raghoo sir, it takes us back to 2001 to 3 years when we used to wait for his classes. And whenever we listen to him, it seems like there cannot be end of the program. Rather, there can at max be a pause to it. So,
Raghu, what happened? Can you connect through your phone? Otherwise, I'll just, because I would have thanked you, so it should be there. Just see if you can connect using your phone.
Tusharji, we do a session with him every Sunday, 11 a.m.
Yes, I see that.
It has been continuing since now we have more than 100 episodes total.
No,
we call it Satsang with Raghoo sir.
Yes, Vijay, I see that notification, but due to the timing issue, we missed that.
But, season 1 was done, season 2 is running now. And it's been I think 30-35 episodes in season 2.
We have all these on YouTube also, no?
Yeah, it is there, but it is only, it's an unlisted link, so it is not publicly available.
Yeah, but we should do it on a channel or
no, we can share it.
We can organize it in form of a channel or some podcast or something like that.
Yeah.
Raghu is coming back.
Yes, he is back now. He is joining. I guess sir is here now.
Coming to technology, technology ki काट भी technology ही है. We cannot, Gabbar Singh के आतंक से खाली Gabbar Singh ही मुक्ति दिला सकता है.
Definitely.
So within that technology, and we have evidence of it, there is a whole closed source technology, and then there is a whole open source things. There is a whole web which is controlled, but in the same China, there is an
sir is back here, I guess.
Yes, I'm back to receive your thanks.
Do you, shall we wind up now?
Yes, ma'am.
I think.
Raghu did 2 brilliant things, and they look so ordinary, but they are really extraordinary. one of the things which I liked most is when he talked against certitude, which is what develops, doesn't allow us to engage democratically with most of the things with ourselves or with society. So one, the brittleness of democracy that Raghoo talked about, and how we have to constantly work for it. And it's not a noun, it's a verb. That's a very, very major thing I think Raghoo brought in brilliantly. And second, his take on certitude. In fact, the whole personality theory he brought back on board when he talked about, the certitude and how, having doubts or being a cynic, being cynical to things, or is good for a democracy. And that's something Raghoo is brilliant. I think we psychologists should be talking about it. And education is all about, this final answer, giving an answer, solving a problem. And so it has constantly worked against what you just now talked about. So if I take what you said seriously, I think I will demand a major revision or reform in education itself. One, and also in the whole pedagogy of our conversation at home, with our children, with our grandchildren. We were talking about, Namita was also talking about how we talk to them, And third, of course, you were bringing in technology and looking at critical majoritarianism, a little more critically, vis-a-vis democracy. That was, the talk was absolutely brilliant, and Raghoo's talk generally is anecdotal, is always a bit biographical, which makes it more interesting. So thank you, Raghoo. And try to get you back again to this conversation, because I want to hear your take on technology. And, and you were talking about constitutions. If you run the assemblies, online, okay, and what kind of democracy you imagine. So there are a couple of issues you didn't find time to reflect on. So we'll see if we can get you back again to conversation through roundtable, and we'll see how much time we have. We would love to get you back on board. So thank you. And thanks a lot on behalf of everybody. Thank you. And before I just stop, I want to mention one thing. What we are going to do in future is that we'll get some, scholars from different, paradigms, including I will see if we can get a delugian, who questions this whole psychology, the individual, who says that, there are machineries outside this individual that drives ego. You don't have to have libido located inside in an individual that drives our actions. We're driven by outside. So I'm ready to do something. You can see lynching and how nationalism drives people to act in certain ways. And that's one of the classical examples Deleuze gives, that for everything, we don't have to look inside an individual, So there are also systems, there are machineries outside individual that drive us. So if we discuss democracy and psychology and look at everything in individual, then probably we are not getting a complete picture. But I'll have to say, if we have a diligent who can engage with some of the psychological concepts. So we'll try to get some feminists, psychoanalysts, diligents, and also critical scholars on board. Some subaltern scholars, those who work on caste, because those who work on caste, they look at the experiential world yet differently. And they have a kind of cynicism towards psychology as a discipline. So we should listen to them. And this is all about listening to scholars, as well as people who have problem with this kind of scholarship or the kind of scholarship we have. So, so in future, we'll try to do one at least a month. And because there are division conveners who should be doing sessions, webinars. If they take longer time, we'll do a month, so by monthly. Otherwise, we'll do once a month. So I thank everybody.
Minity, can I just read out something? It just came on my phone, and I want to read it because it is pertinent out here. It's a quotation from Nietzsche. Insanity in individual is something which is rare, but in groups, parties, nations, epoch, it is the rule. And I think there is a very important message given out here.
I agree.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity of sharing some of my half-baked ideas. I hope they never get fully baked.
Oh, anti-finalist. Half-baked is the reality. So if you say it is half-baked, then I have. The moment I say completely formulated the idea, then I'm in trouble. Thank you, Raghu. And then psychologists who look at themselves like this. So thank you, and we'll announce our next lecture in another 10 days. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
On the behalf of NAOP and everyone here as audience, I would also like to thank Minati ma'am for planning and organizing this wonderful session. It has been a great session, and I am receiving demands from audience that there should be another one with Raghoo sir. And that was expected. That was expected from all of us, that nobody is going to be fulfilled by listening and felt complete by listening to sir. So I am sure, as Minati ma'am has said, there can be another session with sir on the left out issues which we could not discuss today. And thank you everyone. We have been it has been continuously more than 2 hours, and people have been listening to you, sir. I thank you everyone, and I believe that people will be looking for our future programs that Minati ma'am and others at NAOP will be organizing. So on the behalf of everyone, I thank you, Raghoo sir, Minati ma'am, and everyone else here as audience. And if you all permit me now, I would then like to end this meeting for today.
Thank you, Tushar. I also
thank you, Tushar. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot.
Programs. Thank you. Bye then. Thanks, everybody.